Okay, Shana Tova, everyone. Welcome. Good Yontif. Good to be together. You can see on your screen an image of a beautiful stained glass window. And I wonder, among you listening, how many recognize where this window can be found? If you said Holy Blossom Sanctuary on the balcony above the Herman Chapel, you are correct. You can see in the center is the emblem of the United Nations with the wreath of olive branches, a symbol of peace. And at the bottom are the Hebrew words, Umot me uchadot, nations of the United Nations. Now, I don't know the story of how this window came to be. I need to study our temple archives to learn more. We do know that it is dedicated in memory of Dewey David Bloom by his wife and his family in 1968. And we know that when the United Nations was founded, it was considered by Jews everywhere to be a symbol of the dawning of the Messianic age, of the beginning of the first flowering of the arrival of Yemot HaMashiach. It was such a hopeful new institution. Every year when we bring our confirmation class, our grade 10 students to New York City, the UN was on our itinerary. And I remember bringing the students, including Bob Ray's daughters, and we would ask the kids, where have you seen that emblem before? And of course they always knew. And the guides were floored by it. Every time the UN guides, the tour guides would say they'd never heard of any house of God anywhere that featured the emblem of the United States, of the United Nations. So I think it is unusual. I can't say it's unique in all the world, but it certainly is unusual. It is our unique pleasure to welcome Ambassador Bob Ray to be with us, to share his reflections with us on this Yom Kippur. I invited him many months ago, actually, before his appointment to the ambassadorship, before it was announced, that is. And so after I heard the good news, I called and I sheepishly asked if he still might possibly be willing, could he maybe join us still on Yom Kippur afternoon? And he said without hesitation, of course he would. He said he may just have to join us live from New York City, but that he would be with us. So thank you, Ambassador Ray, for being so gracious with your time. It is our pleasure to welcome you and Arlene back to Holy Blossom Temple. Before I call on Michael Davis to introduce the ambassador, I just want to signal to everyone participating at home that there will be time for Q&A. So as you're listening to the address, if you have a question, by all means, you can just drop it in the chat box and we'll be drawing from those questions for the Q&A section of our time together today. So Michael Davis, I welcome you onto the screen. Michael is a leading member of the congregation. He served on the temple board. He's a leading member of the Toronto Jewish community. He sits on very critical committees for the UJA, especially now when hard decisions need to be made around allocations. So Michael, thank you for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you. So the Honourable Bob Ray was born in 1948 in Ottawa. His paternal grandfather was a Jewish immigrant from Lithuania to Scotland. He learned about his Jewish roots as an adult. He married Arlene Pearlie Ray, who grew up at Holy Blossom, and they raised their 3 daughters at this temple. We are pleased to welcome them all back today. Ambassador Ray received his Bachelor of Arts in Modern History in 1969 from the University of Toronto, a Master's of Philosophy as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University in 1971, and graduated from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 1977. Between 1978 and 2013, Mr. Ray was elected 11 times to federal and provincial parliaments and served as Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995. He was the first person to lead an NDP government in Ontario. He became a member of Parliament for the Liberal Party of Canada in 2008 and was interim leader of the party from 2011 to 2013, replacing Michael Ignatieff. He served in this capacity until the election of Justin Trudeau as leader. After his departure from politics, he returned to his passion for social justice, which goes back to his early days in student politics and community service. His work focused on Canada's role in dealing with Aboriginal rights, human rights, healthcare, and education. In October of 2017, Mr. Ray was appointed Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar, where he produced a report entitled, "Tell Them We Are Human." In March of this year, he was named Canada's Special Envoy on Humanitarian and Refugee Issues, and this past July, he was appointed Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations. The UN, founded after the Second World War to promote maintenance of peace and security and social progress, better living standards, and human rights. At the time, world Jewry really believed it was a sign that one day the visions of the biblical prophets would come to realization and the peoples of the world would be united under God's moral rule. However, the UN has a long way to go. Ambassador Ray has titled his talk today, Hillel's 3 Questions and Some Updated Reflections. We look forward to his wisdom and perspective.
Well, thank you very much, Rabbi. Michael, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And Rabbi, it's good to see you and good to see so many friends. I'm very honored to have been asked to join you on Yom Kippur. As you know, my wife Arlene grew up in this congregation, and since our marriage in 1980, which I called the union of the frozen people and the chosen people, Holy Blossom has been the place where we have experienced moments of both great celebration and as well as great sadness. Today, Rabbi Splansky has asked me to join you for a moment of reflection. I'm joining you from New York, and on Saturday, Arlene and I took the ferry from the bottom of Manhattan to visit the Statue of Liberty and the Museum of Immigration at Ellis Island, a trip that I expect many of you have also made. On the ferry, there were families speaking many different languages, enjoying a sunny day, reflecting the diversity of New York, which is quite a wonderful thing to experience. As we made our way around the statue that I think remains very moving and impressive, in the gateway to the harbor of New York, we stopped to read the words of Emma Lazarus's famous poem. I'm going to read them all to you now because its opening stanzas are less familiar to us. The title is The New Colossus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand blows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I don't know about you, but I still find those words remarkably meaningful and stirring. It's worth recalling that for 50 years, until the outbreak of the First World War, an unprecedented movement of people from Europe came to America's shores and also to Canada's shores. Many of us can trace our roots to that dramatic time when our grandparents and great-grandparents left oppression, discrimination, hunger, and conflict for the United States and Canada to find here opportunities our ancestors could barely dream of. Those who could not leave or could not be accepted in the very different world of the 1920s and the 1930s faced the horrors of violence, conflict, dictatorship, and the Holocaust. We remember them in our prayers and thoughts today and rightly ask the most difficult questions about how that could have happened and how we could make sure that it never happens again. In San Francisco in 1945, the nations that defeated fascism agreed to create institutions that they hoped would save future generations from the scourge of war. The trials at Nuremberg established the vital legal principle that crimes against humanity would be met with accountability and justice. International institutions were built to establish greater prosperity, and there was a set of rules to deal with disputes. An American leader, George Marshall, had the imagination and political will to create a plan that would ensure a shared prosperity between North America and a battered and defeated Europe. I've often quoted, in fact, even wrote a book and reflected on Rabbi Hillel's famous 3 questions. If I'm not for myself, then who will be for me? But if only for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when? After I'm reading my book on the 3 questions, my dear friend Dov Marmer said that it wasn't Jewish enough and it wasn't socialist enough. Well, I have to confess, I plead guilty on both counts. As Mr. Davis has already recounted, my grandfather was born in Lithuania, and his name when he was born was Goodman Cohen. When he died, his name was William Ray. I was raised as a Christian, and while I've attended my 3 daughters' bat mitzvahs with great pride, I am not, as Davis said, Jewish enough. As for socialism, even as a New Democrat, I embraced both liberal ideals as well as social democratic thinking, with a heavy dose of experience and lessons from the political school of hard knocks. As a result, my latest tour of duty in Parliament was, as you will all know, as a liberal. But my ideals have not changed. I'm now serving as Canada's ambassador to the UN, a job my father Saul once held, an institution whose creation is commemorated at Holy Blossom, but whose work is now challenged and criticized by many. Richard Holbrooke, an American ambassador, once commented about the UN and its critics, and I'm quoting, he said, "Blaming the UN for the extent of conflict and injustice in the world is like blaming Madison Square Gardens when the Knicks lose." I believe the institution has its faults and its flaws, but the faults of the world are not, to borrow from Shakespeare, in our stars, but rather in ourselves. Well, we all know Hillel's questions come in order. And the first question speaks to the importance of freedom, of identity, and the importance of self-interest and self-help. Developmental psychologists and classical economists would be pleased. One of my arguments was whether the first question should be the first question or should it be the second question? And he felt that it should be the second question and the second question should be the first question. But actually, I think he's wrong. I think it's important to start with freedom. I think it's important to start with identity. And it's important to start with the fundamental premise that what we do as individuals, the efforts that we make as individuals, in fact, are fundamental to human existence. But Hillel, in the same breath, Hillel reminds us that self-interest is not enough, and that putting ourselves first cannot be the whole story. There's a lot of people who want to say X first or Y first. That's fine, but the question is, and then what? And that, I think, is what Hillel is asking. Without solidarity, without compassion, and without empathy, we are not recognizing our full humanity, which may start with individualism, but does not end there. Toronto's first mayor, William Lyon Mackenzie, put it this way when he said, "Charity begins at home, but it does not end at our doors." Just a few years after Mackenzie spoke those words, the United States and Canada were faced with an incredible influx of immigrants, incredible in its time and still remarkable. Immigrants from Ireland, in numbers and health the likes of which it is hard to imagine today. Toronto's population doubled from the 1840s to the 1860s. Imagine for a moment our own population now doubling in response to a world refugee crisis. Different time. Well, the COVID pandemic is testing the tension between Hillel's first two questions and forces us to reflect on the relationship between self-interest and the public good. Although it's right to say that in important ways we're all in the same boat, it really cannot be said that COVID is a leveler. It is, as one observer has so rightly said, a revealer. It's also a magnifier. It reveals the difference between rich and poor countries, between those whose health systems are well run and efficient, and those that are not, between those countries that took steps early and those countries that did not. It also reveals a lot about the social realities of the differences between rich and poor peoples, hitting those whose health is vulnerable because of pre-existing conditions, and of course, hitting those whose jobs put them at risk of exposure. The worst outbreaks in Canada have been in seniors institutions. And Canada has the dubious distinction of being the country in the world with the highest rate of mortality among those living in institutions. This is a truly shocking and sobering reality, and it reveals a darker, meaner side of Canada's story that we must now deal with as a country. After several months of isolation and quarantine, we know that this contagious and cunning virus can be fought. But we need to understand that wealthier governments have been able to assist their populations much better, much more fulsomely, and much more generously than the poor countries can possibly imagine. COVID-19 is now a global pandemic, and it's also a rolling pandemic. Many people, I think all people, are saying to themselves, I'm tired of this. I want it to be over. But the problem is the virus is not tired of us. It has not hit us all at the same time. The most vulnerable globally are those living in conditions of deep poverty and fragility, those forcibly displaced, those without homes, those living in refugee camps, and in cities with huge populations that are extremely overcrowded. The full brunt of COVID-19 has yet to be felt in these places. And when it comes to deaths, tragically, could come in the hundreds of thousands. But it's important to remember that COVID-19 doesn't just destroy lives and people's health. It also destroys jobs and wealth. We've been wrestling with this in Canada, we've been wrestling with it in the United States. We all know the extraordinary efforts that governments have had to make, spending money and borrowing money at levels that are absolutely unprecedented in our history. And it's only natural that we look to our own governments and expect our own governments to look after us first. We've become supporters of Hillel's first question, take care of us. But what we also need to appreciate is that the problems don't just stop at our borders. Just as we need to understand the deep fragility and vulnerability of different communities in our own country, for example, Indigenous communities, people living in remote communities, people who are homeless. We also need to understand the need to lift up our eyes, not just unto the hills, but lift them up unto the world so that we can see the full dimensions and the full consequences of this crisis. Emma Lazarus talked in her poem of the tempest-tossed homeless. Well, there are close to 100 million displaced people and refugees in the world today who are surviving in camps that are flooded by monsoons and weather conditions we have to imagine in order to really fill our hearts with the compassion that's necessary to respond. I've had the opportunity and indeed the honor to represent Canada in visiting Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh over the last several years. And while I haven't been there since COVID started, there are reports that make it very clear that COVID has made it much, much worse. And host countries like Bangladesh, if you take the country of Bangladesh and take the Rohingya and understand that host countries have spent decades trying to emerge from poverty, and they are now facing a deep crisis. A huge part of their economy is based on remittances, just like our grandparents and great-grandparents sent money home, sent money back in order to bring people over. That's what people are doing today. The remittance economy is actually worth more to the developing world than all of the official aid assistance that's given by all of the other countries in the world. What we do as a country is way, way, way less than what people are actually doing for themselves and for their families. Well, those checks have stopped coming. And when they arrive back home in the millions, those remittance workers will be hungry for a job, any job. Meanwhile, their country's finances are a mess, a much bigger mess than ours are. No revenues, continuing expenditures, big debts across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, involving billions and billions of people. It is the same story. Well, we all know the truth that people are not commodities and world finances are not just a bunch of numbers across a page. Growing poverty means more political unrest. It means a turn to more nationalism, more ethnocentrism, and more xenophobia. That's what happened in the 20s and 30s, and I believe it could well happen again. Global institutions will face a deep crisis, at first of funding, but then a deeper question about the world itself. And already Prime Minister Trudeau and the Prime Minister of Jamaica have called a meeting tomorrow with heads of government from around the world, with the Secretary General of the United Nations, to focus on the nature of this crisis and what more can be done about it. I must say I'm very proud of the leadership that our own government is showing in getting this conference off the ground. But just as the world determined to try and create a better approach in the years after World War II, we shall have to do the same. Because we were not only attempting at that time to end the scourge of war, we were also trying to put an end to the folly of the pre-war economic system, which had failed to end the Great Depression. I must say, since getting here, only a few short weeks ago, it's been very striking to have to admit that the world has not come together to fight COVID-19 as much as the world has turned inwards to allow those able to fight the illness and the repercussions of the illness in their own countries. But as this initiative between Canada and Jamaica, I think, demonstrates, we luckily have a government that believes that we do have to right this global ship, because only a more concerted and connected approach is really going to work. It's very good that Canada has joined the international effort to find a vaccine that will be universally available at cost to the peoples of the world, as was announced just yesterday. From a health perspective, we know that as long as a virus like COVID-19 exists anywhere, it can very quickly touch us all everywhere. That much we get. I think we all understand that. Or not all, but most people do. But what we need to embrace is something that's, I think, equally true, which is economically, no nation is an island. Producers need consumers, not just at home, but around the world as well. A world that is full of poverty, is full of violence, full of deprivation, is not going to be a secure or a tranquil place. It won't be a place where people feel that they can be settled enough to worry and focus on the need to make a living and to create prosperity. It will also force far more human movement, and people will be insisting on finding their place in the sun somewhere. There will be a terrible price to pay, I believe, if we neglect our international personality. And I think Canadians will be among those countries that will pay for it very heavily. It is a challenging time, and for a great many, it has also been a tragic time. But we should not let an experience like this go to waste. In our own lives of forced isolation, we've turned to music, to art, comedy, to new ways of finding company. We've cleaned our basements and sorted old books and reminded ourselves how to read a whole book, as well as to connect with family and friends. But as we enter this new phase, the real work now begins. And I think we need to do what we can do, what our forefathers did, to try to make not only our homes and our families and our countries a better place, but to make the world a better place. The answer to Hillel's third question speaks for itself. If not now, when? I thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you. And as you know, I grew up reading more of the Book of Common Prayer than I did the Torah. And there is a phrase in the Book of Common Prayer, because Anglicans say, maybe they have more need of it, but they ask for atonement every week. And we do our confessions every week. And in the Book of Common Prayer, we recognize not only the sins that we have committed, but what is it that we have left undone? And over our bedroom and at our cottage, there's a wonderful framed tapestry, which just says the words, "Be not weary in well-doing." I think that's a wonderful Victorian encouragement for all of us. Be not weary in well-doing, because there is so much to do. And yes, there is so much we have left undone. Thank you so much. Shana Tova.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray. It's always good to learn with you and from you. Joining on the screen also is Herschel Ezrin, who is a leading member of the congregation and an advisor to many, including to me. And I've recently learned that he is a classmate of yours as well. So Herschel, yes. Would you like to kick off the questions? And again, I want to encourage those who are participating from home, if you'd like to drop a question in the comment section, we will draw from those and pass them on to Ambassador Ray.
Ambassador, you've given us a lot to think about, especially putting it in the context of COVID-19. You've been a political leader for many years. How do you engage the public to understand the points that you're trying to make today?
I think that's a great question. And I think, you know, the more I think about it, the more I believe that, and I hesitate to say this in front of the rabbi, but I think the only way we can really convince people is not by talking about what's the moral thing to do or what's the generous thing to do. There will always be people who will do what the generous thing is. But when we look at the scale of the problem we're now facing, where the world economy is really on the brink of a real challenge, we need to, I think, connect people's lives with the world around us, and really try to preach a little bit what I was talking about in my talk, and that is, this is in our interest. It is not in our interest to have the world going to hell in a handbasket. And if that requires us to do more financially, then we must do more. And in case anybody is wondering, I don't think we're going to be asked to do anywhere near what governments have indicated they're prepared to do at home. I mean, at home, yes, there's criticism of the government. Of course, there are political differences should it be 200 billion or 300 billion. And Herschel, you and I have both been in governments where these numbers were just would have been absolutely incomprehensible to say we're going to go from having a $25 billion deficit to having a $350 billion deficit. It just would have been unimaginable. We're not being asked to do things on that scale. What we're being asked to do is significantly more than what we're doing now. Our foreign assistance is about $6 billion. I think we're going to have to look at an increase in that, not to the point of multiple times spending, but more. And I think and know that our government is considering that right now in terms of how effectively they can do that. And I think that's something we have to do. And I think in explaining it to Canadians, we have to say it is in our interest to do it. This really is an investment in our future prosperity, in our future security. And by the way, it's also the right thing to do. The famous philosophical question, who is our neighbor? Who is the stranger? Is the stranger the person who lives next door, or is the stranger the person who lives at the other side of the world? And obviously we have to temper what we do to say, well, it's got to be effective, it's got to be efficient. We don't want to just throw money around, it can't be wasted. But we do need to in a coordinated way, look at, well, what would be the impact of not responding to the crisis on a global level?
If I could just continue for a second, Rabbi, you said something in your remarks about how in ways the COVID crisis and its impacts reminded you of the 1920s and the 1930s, in which there were significant issues that arose mainly of an economic character, and they drove people to extreme, severe decision-making. Do you see something like that happening again?
Yes. I think if you look back, I think I've been doing quite a bit of reading about the Marshall Plan. When you think about it, it was an incredible initiative for the United States to take, and Canada participated in, frankly, a pretty, a minor way, but we did engage with the Americans on it. I think that Marshall was really learning the lessons of the 1920s and 30s. We're coming out of the First World War. There was very much a beggar thy neighbor approach. People were trying to extract money out of countries that had no money. We're trying to say, well, if you can't pay us, we're going to increase, how much we'll give you a deferment, but eventually you're going to owe us more. And we ended up with this kind of cycle that was extremely unproductive and unhelpful. And I think Marshall learned from that. But let's remember, the world at that time was the Atlantic world. It was the world on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. Our generosity did not extend at any time. Our thinking did not extend to Africa or to Asia but now we live in a UN with 193 countries and a global system that doesn't have the architecture to respond to it. So my fear is, and I'll be very direct with you, is that if we don't respond, we are going to see more violence. We're going to see more xenophobia. We're going to see more nationalism. We're going to see more refugees. We're going to see more chaos in countries that many people have difficulty knowing where they are, how to spell them. But that's the reality of our time, and that will have a knock-on effect on us, big time.
Thank you.
Don't want to miss the opportunity to ask about your early impressions of Israel's place at the United Nations. I know many listening today are wondering about that.
Well, I mean, it's very early days, early impression. The Israeli ambassador is a former cabinet minister. He's very direct. He has a lot of political experience. I've met with him. I didn't know him before, but we had a good, candid, a good exchange. It was very frank, as you would expect from an Israeli politician of some experience. But it's been interesting for me to watch how the reality is Israel has more quiet friends than perhaps people realize. And I think we're beginning, obviously, the two agreements that have been signed, the shifting of ground in the Gulf states, it will have an effect. And I think that in many parts of the world, there is a great appreciation for what Israel has been able to do as a country and how well it's been able to succeed economically. And I think there will always be what I would call ritual votes. But I would ask people not to get fixated on that, because there's some of those things are going to be the last thing to change. But I believe that in terms of its presence and its contribution, like I said, there are more people who understand completely the challenges that Israel faces in the region, and the fact that the description of the Israel-Palestine conflict as a morality play in which there's one white hat and one black hat and one good group and one bad group, that is, I think people understand that is not in any sense an accurate description of the complexity, even of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, but certainly not of the overall politics of the region. It remains, the United Nations, the countries in the UN, many of them remain fixated on it, but I do think there's a lot more nuance in the relationships than people, I think, understand and appreciate.
So I'll ask a follow-up question that comes from a university student, member of the congregation, who is a student of history, and he's asking for your opinion. Why do so many progressive Western countries vote against Israel or abstain each time there is an arbitrary resolution singling Israel out?
Well, I mean, it goes back a long way. If you're a student of history, you'll know that Israel was admitted to the vote in favor of partition of the old British mandate came after the Second World War, and Israel then was admitted to the United Nations after that and after the War of Independence. I think the view in a lot of parts of the world is that yes, that was the War of Independence, but that and the War of '67 created problems that still need to be resolved. In other words, the displacement of the Palestinians, and there will always be a debate about exactly the circumstances under which that happened, but has created a problem, a significant challenge. And now we've come to a point where I think more and more countries are talking about the two-state solution, and even in the Arab world, there's I think a widespread acceptance by their governments of the legitimacy of a two-state approach. I think a lot of Western countries, of which Canada is not one, feel that we have to continue to keep on lecturing the Israelis about that one issue in order to get them to move on it. And my own view is a little different. My view is that there has to be a conversation between the Israelis and the Palestinians about how they're going to govern themselves, and that negotiation needs to happen. We've been urging a direct negotiation for a long time. I think with great regret, the Palestinians have declined to do so. And I hope, I think entirely naively, that position changes, that in fact we do get back to a situation where there are negotiations. But as I said, that I've never, regardless of my own history and background, I've never been comfortable with the notion that the best way to understand a conflict is to think that there's one villain and one good guy. I just think life is not like that. And I think everybody needs to look in the mirror and say, well, what can we do to bring this to a conclusion? And it takes two sides to do that.
So I'd like to just ask a question that sort of flows from that answer in a way. When we look at the United Nations, we obviously look at the General Assembly and the Security Council, and we look at votes and things like that. But a lot of the good that the United Nations does is through its specialized agencies. Agencies like right now, the World Health Organization, the FAO, and others. What can be done to get them both the respect that I personally believe they deserve? I'd be interested in your views about that. And how do we get support rolling for them again? Because as you've said in various parts of your talk, nothing is going to change for us individually in Canada if we just want to talk about the self-interest, and we don't think about this as a global issue and a global challenge. And it's these kinds of agencies that have a unique ability to perhaps address them.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, the UN is a couple of things. I mean, when people blame the UN, what they really mean is, I blame the countries who are in the UN, who are members of the UN. The great Russian chess player, who's now a famous political dissident who lives in New York, Garry Kasparov, who I've met on a number of occasions. And I told him I was going to be coming to the UN as ambassador. He said, "Oh, the UN," he says, that's just dictators on parade. I said, "Well, yeah, there are some dictators, there's no question. But it's not like the UN has made them dictators. It's that their countries have made them dictators." And so, yeah, there are some governments that have terrible human rights records and that do things we profoundly disagree with. There have been, you know, the resolution that Zionism is racism and imperialism, which was a real blot on the conscience of the General Assembly, in my opinion. It was finally gotten rid of. People finally realized that wasn't going to do any good. I think it's really important to understand that's a very small part of it. Now, the Security Council, dysfunctional for a variety of reasons. So that's not good. But where can the UN do good? Well, there's two ways. One of them is, you have described, Herschel, quite rightly, all of the institutions that have been created, UNICEF, the UNHCR, the WHO, UN Women, organizations that make a huge difference in the world. And we're very much a UN development program that we're very much involved with as a country, and everybody's involved with them to try to make them work better and give them the funds that they need. And they're being stretched to the limit. I mean, they are absolutely being challenged by COVID in terms of being able to deliver programs, being able to do anything for people. It's a huge, huge problem in the world. The other thing that we can do is create alliances and create creative ways of moving opinion and changing opinion. And I think what we're organizing with Jamaica is a good example. We set up a group called Financing for Development, Friends of Financing for Development, and we hold meetings and we then move it along, and then we talk to the IMF and we talk to the World Bank and we talk to the OECD and we talk to the wealthier countries and we talk to the host countries, the donor countries and the host countries. We talk to everybody and just try to cajole the system along so that it gets results and gets more results than it otherwise would. If we didn't have something like this, we'd have to invent it, because we can't exist effectively if we're just by ourselves. It doesn't work.
Thank you.
I'll ask a question going back to Hillel's 3 questions. At their simple reading, they are neutral on the hopeful scale. But I wonder, as you study those questions, do you see anything under the surface that hints at something resembling hope?
Yes, absolutely, because of the obviousness of the answer to the last question. Because I think what Hillel is saying is, look, we all know that inertia and stasis is sort of what happens. And we all know our capacity for putting off difficult decisions, putting off our sense of obligation, putting off what we know we need to do. And the underlying message of the third question is action. Action. You need to move. You need to do something. You need to move forward. And, you know, while I hope I live, and that therefore, in a sense, hope is almost a moral obligation that you can't give up, because in giving up, you're conceding too much. You're conceding to the world when you shouldn't be doing it. And the first question I've always found very refreshing, because it's a way of saying to people, well, look, why would anybody else help you if you're not prepared to help yourself? Why would you think that somebody would do something if you're not? You know, the famous joke about, I've heard it in a Christian context, but the guy walks into a church and keeps praying and praying and praying that he would win the lottery because his life is such a mess and he really wants it. And finally, after he does this over and over again, he leaves and the great sound comes from the sky. God says, you have to buy a ticket, sir. You have to buy a ticket. And really, what he's talking about is buying a ticket. You have to buy a ticket. You have to make an effort. And making the effort becomes the critical first step. And that might be seen by some people as saying, well, you're blaming the victim. And I think Hillel would say is there are no victims in that sense. We're all of us capable of doing something to help ourselves, and we have to figure out what that is. But then he goes on to say, but you know, if you're only helping yourself, what are you doing? And as I said, the reason I think it's hopeful at every level. I think it's hopeful. Yeah, that's what I would say.
So I wonder if I could perhaps ask you, Ambassador Ray, about some other notables that you've met. Have you been able to interact yet with the Chinese, for example? And where are they in terms of both the relation? Can you share with us anything about their relationship with Canada, but more importantly, how they see the UN?
Well, the short answer to the first part is no. I have not had the opportunity yet, and I regret that. It's not a deliberate. It's not like we're shunning each other. It's just like the opportunity hasn't arisen at the moment. But I think the Chinese. It's interesting to watch. There are countries that really believe in the UN, like Canada and a number of other middle powers in Europe and elsewhere, who see the UN as the best we've got. Like it's the only game in town. We've got to make it work. We got to make it work. We'll figure out how to make it work. And then I have to say, I think there are countries that are not interested in making it work, who don't believe it should work, and what really are prepared to kind of, put a hammer into the machine at every time they get. And the Chinese are not actually like that. What the Chinese are trying to do is to use the UN as one of many different vehicles that they will try to use to take a bigger place in the architecture of the world. If you watch the first day, and you can go back and watch them on tape, if you watch the first day of the General Assembly, there's a week called High Level Week, where normally everybody comes here to give a speech. But nobody's come this year to give a speech. Everybody's just reading their speeches off a Zoom call and just giving their speeches. People are watching them. It was very interesting for me to watch the speeches of 4 very different countries at the beginning: Brazil, United States, Turkey, and China. Very, very, very different speeches, assumptions, views of the organization. But the thing about the Chinese you have to be aware of is that they have an agenda. And so you can't you can't afford to be naive about what that agenda is. So you need to understand that there's this sort of quietly expansionist notion, and it's a little less quiet in some capitals than others in terms of the public diplomacy that they're carrying out. And that expansionism comes with risks to freedom. It comes to risks to the way in which we're used to doing business. And I think we've experienced this very directly in terms of the treatment of the two Michaels and the current challenge that we face between the issues between us right now are serious. They're not easy. They're not easy, and they're not easy to solve, and they're extremely painful for the people who are being affected by them. The families of the two Michaels, I think, are facing a very rough time. But more importantly, or equally importantly, their families are, the two Michaels are, but also many others who are incarcerated in China, the Uyghur population, which is facing enormous discrimination and incarceration, and the people of Hong Kong. And we, of course, have very strong relationships with the people of Hong Kong in Canada. I've visited there many times and established strong relationships with their university leaders and their business leaders and others. And they're speaking from a position of real vulnerability and real pain. The world they thought they had, where there were rules and there was appreciation for what they could bring to the conversation, has been very negatively affected by this expansionism, which is something we have to watch very, very closely.
Thank you.
There's a question from someone who's watching from home, and it's very specific. So if you want to broaden the question, by all means, about Israel and Iran. He writes, Iran and Israel are at the highest levels of tension now. And then the specific question is, how does this affect the Persian Jewish community in Iran? So there's a small minority.
Well, very negatively, very, very negatively. I mean, we all know since 1948, even before, with the rise of nationalism in a great and greater degrees of religiosity in a great many Arab and Muslim countries, the Jewish population has been devastated. I mean, if you were to think back and look at a map in 1935, let's say, and think of what Alexandria was like, or what Iran was like, what Baghdad was like, what Damascus was like, what Morocco was like, thriving Jewish communities, centers of learning, centers of scholarship, obviously tremendously important for the economies of those countries. It's all gone. I mean, it's disappeared. And many went to Israel. Many have gone to other countries. Many have come to Canada, among other places. Can link themselves to those Sephardi communities. So the community in Iran is in rough shape. It's very, very challenging and difficult for people. And we also have serious issues with Iran as a country. Canada lost a lot of people in that flight that should never what happened should never ever have happened. And I don't think we're getting the answers that we deserve to get from the Iranians as to what took place. And we're not getting anything approaching justice or any kind of transparency with what happened. And their record of brutal incarceration and a real lack of appreciation for the rule of law and for human rights is very, very serious. And plus, in the region, they're a really bad actor. I mean, they are supporting Hezbollah, they're supporting Hamas, they're supporting a lot of groups that do not have peace and stability as their core values. And we need to understand that. And certainly the countries, many of the Sunni countries in the Gulf understand that very strongly, which is why one of the reasons why I think we're seeing this movement happening in Middle Eastern politics, which is quite fascinating. I think we need to understand better the dynamics of those relationships because they're complex. But the Jewish community in Iran is very vulnerable.
Sorry, the great reminder about unmuting yourself, which always happens. I'd like to ask a slightly different question now and ask you to take your own experience in working with Indigenous people in Canada and perhaps talk to us a little about how the Jewish community might be thinking about the ways that it can be more helpful or involved in some of the issues that matter to that community, in which I'm willing to say we probably are ignorant of what those issues are.
I think your question in a way answers itself. I mean, the first thing is learn, knowledge, curiosity. Curiosity is always the first step to compassion and to understanding. I mean, it's a reflection of people living very different lives and often not coming in touch with each other. I mean, if we were living in Winnipeg, the connection between the Jewish community and the Indigenous population would be much, much closer, as it would be in many Western cities, because there's an understanding that the future of those cities will have a lot to do with Indigenous people, because the Indigenous people of all across Canada have become more and more an urban population. There's a mythology, for example, that that the Indigenous people are living way out there and nobody sees them. The reality is that was true, but the reality now is that the Indigenous population is urban. Toronto has well over 100,000 Indigenous people living in Toronto, largely unrecognized as such, although I have to say the mayor, city council, many other religious organizations and others are making an enormous effort to reach out and to try to establish understanding and relationships, and school boards are doing it, and people are trying hard to understand the reality of what is taking place. The Jewish community, I think, is in a very good position. And already, I have to say, there are some leaders in the Jewish community. Larry Tannenbaum, for example, is very interested in Indigenous issues and has been very supportive of some work that Mr. Paul Martin has been doing on Indigenous education. And there are many others who are interested in saying, what can we do? And I think the hard part at the beginning is it's more complicated than just about anything you've ever tried to do, because the gap, the cultural gap, the awareness gap is much, much bigger than you think. And this isn't just something that is true of the Jewish community, it's true of the non-Indigenous community generally, is there's kind of a sense of saying, well, now we've said we're sorry, we've done the land acknowledgement, we've given them money, we've done this and that. Isn't that enough? Like, what more do we have to do? And you have to say, I have to say, that is just the first baby step, because it doesn't begin to understand the challenge of connecting the urbanized, westernized world that we live in to the worldview that we found here when European settlers first arrived, and has never really recovered from that first encounter. The first encounter between those two peoples was a catastrophe. Millions died in North America. Millions and millions died, not from gunshots, but they died from disease. They died because two immune systems collided, and the indigenous people lost out in enormous ways. And we've never really figured out a way to engage in a proper way. And I think governments are trying to do this now. I think they're trying to sort of understand that it's not just about snapping your fingers and saying we'd like to make it better. I mean, famously, Mr. Trudeau's father brought in that white paper in 1968, which said basically, we're going to treat everybody the same. Nobody's going to be treated any differently. We're going to forget about the treaties. We're going to forget about the Indian Act and just get on with it. And of course, it was rejected in total. It was rejected completely by the indigenous people because they said, you don't get it. We have treaties. You signed treaties. You told us you were going to do this, this, and this. You then did that, that, and that. How are we supposed to, establish a relationship in good faith and good trust? So it takes time. And I have to say that, I'm really glad that I spent, 7 years working and intellectually trying to understand more, personally trying to understand more. I can't call myself an expert. I don't consider myself to be an expert at all, but I do feel that it's a journey we all have to go on, because unless we go on that journey, it's not gonna work. It has to work.
So I'll ask one last question. We know that Hillel raised up many disciples, and we know that in all the positions that you've held, you also have taken mentorship very seriously, on and off campus. And so this question comes from a past president of our congregation asking, what are your thoughts as to how we can encourage talented and creative individuals to seek public office and to provide leadership for our national and international institutions like the UN?
Well, I think it's hugely important. I worry a lot about that question because I see more and more that a lot of very talented and committed people are reluctant to engage in a life of public service or politics, and I think that's a bad thing. I think it was the British statesman Edmund Burke who said that bad things happen when good people do nothing, and I think that's absolutely right. If you leave it to others, the best people won't go in, and I think there's a need for really good, dedicated women and men to see public services as a worthy calling. I guess I had it easier because I kind of grew up in a household where public service was sort of what we did. So for me, it was not alien to me. But I think it's something that everybody should try to do for a period. I don't think you have to do it for a whole life. I think Herschel's an example. I mean, Herschel's been in and out of the private sector and the public sector and looking at it in a variety of ways and doing some teaching and giving back. We're all involved in doing that. I think the main thing is just to be, you've got to have a bit of a vocation for it. You've got to believe in, you've got to know that it's not going to be easy. It's not automatic. It's not necessarily what you see on television. You kind of have to pick something you're interested in. But for me, Rabbi, I'd have to say that the most important advice that I ever received and that I pass on to whoever will listen to me is you have to believe in something that's bigger than yourself. As long as the only thing you believe in is yourself, go ahead, try, but why would anybody be interested in why would you persuade anybody of anything? I think the people who've been the most persuasive leaders that I have known are people who believe in something that's bigger than them and who know that it will endure after they've gone. It's not about them. They are part of a tradition. And looking at it from, where I sit, 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the Jewish community, I would say one of the greatest things that I love about the Jewish community is this sense of tradition and of learning, of scholarship, and of service. And I think a lot of it comes from the very earliest teachings that kids get, which is that God is above us all. God is there. It's not about us, it's about God. And I think that's just such a huge thing to have in your minds and to have in your hearts. I love the story. I've never visited Ruth Bader Ginsburg's office, but I love the story of how Zedek was right there in her office. I think you told that last night. I think that's a great story. It's bigger. Justice is bigger. God is bigger. And I think if you have that in your hearts, and the other thing I always say to people is if you don't have a stomach for it, if you don't have a passion for it, don't do it. Like, forget it. It's not going to come down you. It's not going to land on your plate. Herschel will know. I mean, nobody asked me to run when I ran when I was 28 years old. Nobody said, "Oh, you should really do this." And I just said, "No, I want to do this." And you've got to have a bit of that spark, or you're not going to make it.
You've had a lot of that spark, unfortunately, for all of us.
Well, the spark hasn't gone. That's the thing, is that people keep saying, "When are you gonna stop?" The answer is no, not ready yet. That's it. Still going.
Rabbi, is there another question, or?
I think while this is really fun, and I'd like to continue, I do know that we have to pick up with our prayer services soon enough. So Herschel, please do the honors of concluding the program.
It's my pleasure to do the honors and to thank you, Ambassador Bob, if I can call you that,
please,
for speaking with us today and for answering our questions. I hope that I'm not stereotyping too much to say that by raising all the questions that you did and being argumentative as you can be, that you've in fact deserve your honorary membership in our clan, because that's just the nature of things. And I wanted to take a couple of things that you reminded us about that apply so much to Yom Kippur. You talked at one point about the faults are in ourselves. You can't just blame institutions. If you really want to do something about things, you've got to do something yourself. And I think that is in itself a very important message on Yom Kippur. So is the idea that we sometimes have to face truths that we may not like. The way you reminded us about the shameful conditions that have existed in seniors' homes and senior care homes in Canada. We lost so many people relative to proportions around the world in that. We can't excuse ourselves. We have to do something about it. You also told us, and I like the way you started with Esa Einai El Harim, we should look towards the hills, and reminded us that problems don't stop just at our borders. And that in fact, to deal with some of the problems that we may find ourselves facing, we're going to be having to look at how we can help people around the world. I particularly liked your mention about the pandemic, which showed the relationship between self-interest and public good, coming back to Hillel, but that COVID was not a leveler, you said. Instead, it's a revealer, a magnifier, a magnification of the problems between rich and poor, between good healthcare systems and ones that don't work very well, between those who act early and those who act later, and about the social realities that are all there. And you did remind us in that way that the growing poverty and the growing challenges that exist around the world could lead to broader unrest and challenges that we will ourselves have to face. But sadly, as I think you've described, with the pandemic, the way we look at it today, the world is turned inwards, and we're not working together as much as we can to fight together. And I think that's the call to action that you're offering and challenging us all with on this Yom Kippur Day. it's clear that your ideals over the many years that I've had the benefit and the good fortune of knowing you have not changed. But as Canadians, I can say on all our behalfs that we're all the better for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. It was a very meaningful invitation, Rabbi, and I was not about to turn it down. And I will always be available to you and to the community to be of assistance. I really appreciate it very much.
We wish you much koach, much strength and success in all your endeavors, and know that you have a lot of friends and fans cheering for you here at Holy Blossom Temple.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
And Yasher Koach Herschel and Michael Davis as well. Thank you for kicking off this study session. I do want to invite everyone to join us for Mincha service. We'll begin at 3:30. That's less than an hour from now. And we're going to go straight through all the way through Ne'ilah with Yisker somewhere there in between. So it is a holy day, and that we know that prayer takes on many forms, and learning is a form of worship as well. So thank you for the learning today. And
Rabbi, if you don't mind, you gave me a cheat sheet before. There are a couple of other things I'm supposed to remind people about. So if you don't mind, I'm going to do that. For members of Holy Blossom Temple, the virtual atrium opens at 3 p.m. for meeting and greeting fellow congregants to wish one another Shana Tova. Mincha starts at 3:30. Which will be followed by a newly revised martyrology service by Yizkor and by Ne'ilah. If you're looking for some good company for Break the Fast, please join our Zoom dining room at 7:30 p.m. And all links are found on the website, holyblossom.org. If you need any assistance, our helpline is standing by to answer your questions and to guide you. So, Gemar Tov.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Be well.